The fatal eye splinter of the king. On June 30th, 1559, the royal tournament grounds at Rue Saint-Antoine in Paris were filled with spectators celebrating the dual wedding of the king's daughter and sister. Henry II, 40 years old and considered one of the most skilled jousters in his realm, prepared for what would be his final ride. The king wore a black and white plumed helmet with a golden visor, ornate but offering less protection than standard tournament armor. His opponent was Gabriel Montgomery, captain of the Scottish Guard. Montgomery had tried to withdraw from the match, but Henry insisted they continue. The two men charged toward each other on their third pass. Their lances collided with tremendous force. Montgomery's lance shattered upon him. A large wooden splinter, nearly 6 inches long, penetrated the king's helmet. The crowd fell silent as the king remained upright in his saddle for several seconds before his body went limp. Attendants rushed to his side. When they removed his helmet, they discovered the horrific truth. The splinter had entered through his right eye, driving fragments of wood and metal into his brain. Blood poured from the wound as the king moaned in agony. Henry remained conscious. He could feel the wood embedded in his skull, pressing against his brain tissue. The royal physicians, including the famous surgeon Ambroise Paré, worked desperately to extract the fragments. Each attempt to remove the splinters caused excruciating pain. The wound quickly became infected despite their efforts. For 10 days, Henry drifted between consciousness and delirium. The infection spread deeper into his brain. The king experienced seizures, periods of paralysis, and moments of clarity where he understood his fate. The pain was constant and unbearable. By July 9th, his brain had swollen significantly, putting pressure against his skull. On July 10th, after nearly 2 weeks of suffering, Henry II of France died from the infection that had consumed his brain. His last hours were spent in agony, unable to speak or move, trapped in a body that was shutting down around him. Impalement through the skull. In the spring of 1438, Paris hosted a grand tournament that drew knights from across Europe. Among them was Piers de Massy, a respected French nobleman known for his aggressive style in the lists. He was considered a formidable jouster, having won several contests throughout northern France. That day, he faced the English knight John Astley in what was called a joust of war. Unlike more common tournaments where lances had coronals, blunted, crown-shaped tips, this match used sharp-pointed lances. The weapons were solid oak, 9 feet long, with metal tips designed to pierce armor. Both men knew the risks. The crowd fell silent as they took their positions at opposite ends of the field. At the signal, both knights spurred their horses forward. Their mounts reached full gallop, thundering toward each other at nearly 30 miles per hour. Astley aimed his lance perfectly, keeping it steady as the distance closed. When they met at center field, his weapon struck with devastating precision. The lance hit Massey directly in the face. The metal tip punched through his helmet's visor, shattering the steel plate. Witnesses described a sickening crack that echoed across the field. The lance drove straight through Massey's skull, entering just below his left eye and emerging from the back of his head. The force of the impact lifted Massey from his saddle. For several seconds, his body remained impaled on Astley's lance, suspended in midair. Blood poured from both sides of the wound, coating the wooden shaft. When Astley lowered his weapon, Massey slid off and collapsed to the ground, still moving. Incredibly, Massey was still conscious. His body convulsed as he tried to breathe through the blood filling his throat. His hands clawed at his ruined face, fingers touching splintered bone and exposed brain tissue. The crowd watched in horror as he struggled for nearly a minute, making terrible gurgling sounds. Death finally came when the blood loss and brain damage became too severe. His body went limp, his final movements nothing more than random muscle spasms. Dragged to death by a wild horse. On June 27, 1241, a forbidden tournament was held at Ware Priory in Hertfordshire, despite King Henry III's explicit ban on such events. Gilbert Marshall, the 4th Earl of Pembroke, was among the participants. At 44 years old, Marshall was an experienced nobleman but lacked the extensive tournament training of his more famous father, William Marshall. He arrived riding a magnificent Spanish stallion.
Woodstock's Christmas tournament, a chance to prove my worth.
The horse was adorned with expensive
Let the
trappings
games
that marked
begin.
Gilbert's status. It stood nearly 17 hands high, with powerful haunches that made it faster than most tournament mounts. Those close to the field noticed the animal was already agitated, pawing at the ground and fighting against its bit. Gilbert struggled to keep the stallion under control as they prepared to enter the lists. As he urged his mount forward, the horse reared unexpectedly. Gilbert, caught off guard by the sudden movement, was thrown from the saddle. In that moment, disaster struck. His right foot remained caught in the stirrup, a heavy iron construction designed to keep knights stable during jousting impacts. The frightened stallion bolted, dragging Gilbert across the tournament field. His head and shoulders bounced violently against the hard-packed earth. Witnesses described the sickening sound of his helmet repeatedly striking the ground. With each impact, blood sprayed from the openings in his visor. For nearly 100 yards, Gilbert was pulled helplessly behind the panicking animal. His arms flailed as he desperately tried to free himself. His armor, designed to protect against frontal impacts, now became a prison prison of metal scraping against the ground, tearing away at his flesh beneath. Other knights attempted to intercept the horse, but failed to catch the swift Spanish stallion. When the animal was finally stopped, Gilbert was still conscious. His face was unrecognizable, a mass of torn flesh and exposed bone. Blood bubbled from his mouth as he tried to speak. He remained alive for several more hours, his body broken beyond repair. Internal bleeding filled his lungs until he could no longer draw breath. As evening fell, Gilbert Marshall died from his injuries. The groin impalement of the young Earl. In December 1389, the royal court gathered at Woodstock Palace for Christmas celebration that included a grand tournament. Among the competitors was John Hastings, the third Earl of Pembroke, just 16 years old and recently married. Despite his youth, Hastings was eager to prove himself in the lists. He wore elaborate armor adorned with his family crest, but like many young knights, he had chosen lighter protection for greater mobility.
Giới thiệu Count Henry và giải đấu quý tộc tại Đức năm 1326. Tại đấu trường Wassenberg, các hiệp sĩ bước vào cuộc so tài danh dự. Count Henry, với khí phách kiêu hãnh, sẵn sàng chấp nhận thử thách.
An experienced knight who had served in France. Their first two passes were uneventful, with neither lance finding its mark. On the third pass, both riders charged at full tilt. When they met at the center of the field, St. John's lance struck Hastings' shield and shattered as intended, but the physics of the impact sent a large splinter downward at a sharp angle. The wooden shard found the gap between the young Earl's cuisses, the armor protecting his thighs, and his fald, which covered his lower abdomen. The jagged wood tore through Hastings' silk undergarments and plunged deep into his groin. The splinter severed his femoral artery, one of the body's largest blood vessels. Blood immediately began pumping from the wound with each heartbeat. Hastings dropped his lance and clutched at the injury, his gauntleted hands unable to stop the flow. Attendants rushed to the young Earl as he slumped in his saddle. When they lowered him to the ground, they found the wooden splinter embedded nearly 6 inches into his groin. Attempts to remove it only widened the wound. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the frozen December earth. Hastings remained conscious for several minutes, his face growing increasingly pale. He could feel his life draining away with each pulse of blood. Physicians were summoned, but arrived too late. The young Earl's eyes widened in shock as he realized his fate. He attempted to speak, but could only manage a gurgling sound as blood loss sent him into shock. Within 15 minutes of the impact, John Hastings was dead, his young body empty of blood.
Đây là mệnh lệnh.
Death by recklessness at the melee. On August 7th, 1218, a massive tournament was held at Neuss, Germany, drawing nobility from across the whole Roman Empire, unlike the more structured jousts that would later develop. This event was a melee, a chaotic mock battle where dozens of men fought simultaneously in a confined space. Adolf, Count of Berg, a powerful 48-year-old nobleman, joined the fray wearing heavy chainmail reinforced with metal plates. The melee began at midday under the summer sun. Over 60 armored men on horseback charged into the designated field, armed with blunted weapons that could still deliver crushing force. There were few rules and no barriers separating combatants. Victory came by unhorsing opponents or forcing them to yield. Count Adolf had successfully dismounted several knights when the crowd's cheers turned to gasps. In the chaos of crossing horses and clashing weapons, 2 knights collided directly in front of him. One was thrown from his saddle and crashed into the Count's horse. Adolf's mount reared unexpectedly, throwing the Count backward. As he fell, Adolf's helmet struck the pommel of another rider's saddle. The impact crushed the back of his helmet inward, driving the metal directly into his skull. The thin bone at the base of his skull shattered. Fragments of bone were forced into his brainstem, immediately paralyzing him from the neck down. Adolf fell to the ground, unable to move as horses continued to thunder around him. Unable to raise his arms in surrender or call for help, he lay helpless in the dirt. His squire noticed his lord's motionless form and fought through the melee to reach him, but not before 2 more horses trampled over the Count's chest and legs, crushing his ribs. When finally pulled from the field, Adolf was still conscious. His eyes moved frantically, but he could not speak or move. Blood trickled from his ears and nose, clear signs of severe head trauma. Physicians determined his neck was broken and nothing could be done. For 6 agonizing hours, Adolf remained aware as his breathing grew increasingly labored. Each breath became more difficult as his diaphragm gradually ceased functioning. He died that evening, his lungs finally unable to draw air, his mind aware until the very end. The fatal fall of the younger Count of Gelders. On March 3rd, 1326, a prestigious tournament was held near Wassenberg, Germany, where the nobility of the Rhine region gathered to demonstrate their martial prowess. Among them was Count Henry VI of Gelders, a 29-year-old ruler known for his aggressive fighting style and expensive armor. His helm was particularly notable, a great bassinet with a narrow vision slit, offering excellent protection, but severely limiting his field of view. The tournament that day featured jousting with solid lances, heavier than the hollow tournament lances used in more ceremonial events. Each weapon weighed nearly 15 pounds, capable of delivering tremendous force when combined with the weight of horse and rider. Count Henry had already won 2 matches when he prepared to face Baron Wilhelm von Jülich, a rival lord from a neighboring territory. As the two knights charged toward each other, Henry's mount stumbled slightly, throwing off his aim. Wilhelm's lance struck the Count's shield at an awkward angle, glancing upward toward his helmet. The lance tip found the narrow eye slit of Henry's bassinet and penetrated with devastating force. The impact tore the helmet backward, twisting Henry's neck violently. Those near the list heard the sharp crack of vertebrae snapping. The lance tip continued into the Count's left eye socket, destroying the eye and penetrating nearly 3 inches into his brain. The force was so great that Henry was lifted completely out of his saddle and thrown backward off his horse. He landed on his back, his body convulsing as the brain damage triggered immediate seizures. Blood poured from the eye slit of his helmet, which had been pushed into his skull rather than being dislodged. When attendants reached him and removed the crushed helmet, they found half of his face caved inward. The left side of his head was unrecognizable, a mass of shattered bone and brain tissue. Despite the catastrophic injury, Henry remained alive for nearly 20 minutes. He could not speak, but his right eye moved, following the movements of those around him. His breathing came in irregular gasps as his brainstem struggled to maintain basic functions. Blood bubbled from his nose and mouth with each labored breath. As the seizures intensified, blood loss and brain damage finally overcame him. Count Henry died on the tournament field, surrounded by horrified spectators who had come to witness sport but instead saw destruction. The Lord killed for an enemy's horse. On May 19, 1300, a tournament was held at Salisbury, England, drawing knights from across Britain. William, a minor Scottish noble from the powerful Douglas clan, rode into the lists that day unaware of the grudge held against him. He sat atop a magnificent black destrier, a warhorse standing 17 hands high and weighing over 1,400 pounds. His armor was simple compared to the English knights, but his horsemanship was exceptional. Among the spectators was Sir Robert de Ros, an English baron whose lands had been raided by Douglas's men the previous year. The raid had cost de Ros several valuable horses and the life of his cousin. Tournament rules strictly forbade the settling of real grievances in the lists, but de Ros had planned his revenge carefully. William rode against 3 English knights successfully. Before his 4th match, de Ros approached the weapon master and quietly exchanged the blunted lance for a sharpened one. As William prepared for his next joust, de Ros rode into the lists unexpectedly. Officials shouted for him to withdraw, but he charged directly toward Douglas. Instead of aiming for the Scottish lord, de Ros drove his sharpened lance directly into the chest of William's horse. The weapon penetrated the animal's heart, killing it instantly. The massive destrier collapsed forward, its legs buckling beneath its weight. William, caught completely unprepared, was thrown violently over the horse's head. His momentum carried him forward while his feet remained briefly caught in the stirrups. His body rotated in mid-air, causing him to land headfirst on the packed earth. The weight of his armor drove his helmeted head downward with crushing force. Witnesses heard the sickening crack of his neck breaking on impact. The collapse of his horse was not yet complete. As William lay paralyzed on the ground, the massive destrier's body continued its forward momentum and rolled directly over him. The weight of the dying animal, over half a ton, crushed William's chest beneath it. William remained conscious through the initial impact. He could feel his ribs splintering as the horse's weight compressed his chest. His lungs collapsed, making each breath a desperate, futile gasp. Blood filled his mouth as internal hemorrhaging accelerated. His eyes remained open, fixed in a horrified stare as he suffocated, unable to move or cry out. Within minutes, William died, his body broken beyond recognition beneath his fallen mount. The king's brother left brain damaged. In 1279, a grand tournament was held in Paris to celebrate the knighting of several royal princes. Among the participants was Robert of Clermont, the 23-year-old son of King Louis IX of France. Handsome and athletic, Robert had already earned respect in the jousting circuit. That day he wore a great helm typical of the period, a heavy cylinder-shaped helmet that sat directly on his shoulders, offering substantial protection but severely limiting visibility and ventilation. The summer heat was oppressive as Robert prepared for his 3rd match of the day. Sweat poured down his face inside the stifling helmet as he took his position. His opponent was Guy de Montfort, an experienced knight known for his powerful strikes. Both men lowered their lances and charged toward each other across the packed dirt field. When they collided, de Montfort's lance struck Robert's shield with tremendous force. The impact was so violent that Robert's head snapped backward inside his helmet, causing his brain to slam against the inside of his skull. The blow itself didn't penetrate his armor, but it didn't need to. The damage was done by the sudden acceleration and deceleration of his brain within the confines of his skull. Robert remained mounted after the impact, but attendants noticed something was wrong immediately. He dropped his lance and sat motionless in his saddle. When his squires removed his helmet, Robert's eyes were unfocused, and blood trickled from his nose and ears. He could not speak coherently and seemed confused about where he was. The initial injury might have been survivable, but Robert insisted on continuing the tournament despite his condition. He participated in 3 more jousts that day, each impact compounding the damage to his brain. By evening, he could barely stand, vomiting repeatedly and suffering severe headaches. Over the following weeks, it became clear that Robert would never recover. The once brilliant prince became prone to violent outbursts followed by periods of vacant staring. He struggled to recognize family members, his speech became slurred and eventually unintelligible. The injury had destroyed the cognitive functions that made him who he was. Robert's body lived for decades after the tournament, but the man he had been died that day on the field. The royal physicians called it brain fever, but it was what modern medicine would recognize as severe traumatic brain injury. His mental deterioration continued until his physical death in 1317, almost 40 years of living with a shattered mind.